Beneath the soil of history, tragedy isn't buried, it's grown. For centuries, our most essential foods have carried silent curses, disappearing from our tables after war, blight, or political terror. This is the story of the cursed harvest, 15 vegetables that didn't just vanish, but were actively erased from the face of the earth by the hand of man, or the sudden collapse of civilization. The lumper's last stand. 1,000 miles from America, a single ugly variety of potato was quietly nourishing an entire nation. A dense, watery, yet resilient caloric powerhouse known as the lumper. This humble root vegetable was a miracle of efficiency in the cool, damp fields of 19th century Ireland, where the population had exploded thanks to its reliable yield. But the very success of the lumper was the seed of an unimaginable disaster. Nearly every potato in every field was genetically identical, a vast and fatal monoculture waiting for a single enemy. When the devastating potato blight, Phytophthora infestans, arrived from North America in the 1840s, it spread like wildfire through the uniform crops. One day the fields were green, the next they were blackened, decaying husks, and the stench of decay filled the air for miles as the lumper, which had saved millions from hunger, was suddenly the direct agent of the Great Famine. The potato's swift collapse led to mass starvation and migration, erasing the lumper from the fields as people either abandoned farming or stopped trusting the once sacred crop. Today, only specialized seed banks preserve its memory, a chilling reminder that agricultural uniformity can breed catastrophe. The lumper's tragic lesson was learned through starvation, showing us how fragile our food supply truly is. But even a natural blight is less terrifying than the harvest that waits in absolute silence. The silent crop of Zone Zero. It started with a sudden, silent flash in the Ukrainian sky, followed by an invisible, odorless rain. Before the world knew the name Chernobyl, the collective farms and small home gardens of the surrounding villages were producing tomatoes, radishes, and cabbages, unaware they were soaking up an airborne poison. This was the curse of Zone Zero, perfectly ripe, healthy-looking vegetables that had absorbed deadly radionuclides like cesium-137. The invisible nature of the threat turned the soil itself into an enemy, emphasizing the impossible choice: leave the food or consume the poison. When the immediate evacuation order came, families had to leave everything in the fields of Pripyat and Polskoye, including their harvests, which rotted in the ground or lay in abandoned cellars, soaking up more contamination. These were gardens turned into silent, deadly traps. The immediate tragedy of the explosion gave way to the subtle, psychological curse that followed, as the fear and suspicion of invisible contamination made even safe produce suspect for years across the Soviet bloc. A tomato that looked pristine could be a death sentence. A bushel of apples, a slow poison. This tragedy erased not just the current crop, but the trust in local food systems entirely, leaving ghost gardens across the massive exclusion zone. Today, while some wild plants return, the memory of those final poisonous harvests, a bounty of food that could never be eaten, still haunts the landscape. The land has tried to heal, but the memory of that invisible blight shows us that some harvests are ruined not by nature, but by man's destructive science. Yet the next tragedy was born not from science, but from the brutal theft of the soil itself, the Wampanoag's last seed. For thousands of years before the arrival of European ships, the Wampanoag white flint corn was the backbone of a civilization, a sacred, hardy crop providing the very sustenance of the people. This corn was not planted alone. It was cultivated using the ingenious Three Sisters method, where corn, beans, and squash grew together in a perfect self-sustaining harmony, fertilized with fish and deep ancestral knowledge. The tragedy was not a famine, but a creeping cultural displacement. As colonial settlements expanded, the Wampanoag people were systematically driven from their ancestral lands. This loss meant more than just the loss of territory. It was the loss of the specific soil, the unique microclimates, and the ritualistic knowledge required to plant and perpetuate these specific heirloom varieties. The white flint corn, which had evolved over countless centuries to thrive in that exact region, could not simply be picked up and planted somewhere else. It became economically irrelevant and culturally isolated, fading into memory as the system that supported it crumbled. Its near total vanishing represents the deep cultural tragedy of conquest. the erasure of a sophisticated, self-sufficient food system built on a sacred seed. Today, while the memory is slowly being revived by preservationists, the near extinction of this corn is a poignant reminder of the price paid when one civilization's land is stolen and its most sacred crops are abandoned. But can a single storm dismantle an entire food lineage in a modern American city? The flood's revenge. In the tight-knit Creole communities of New Orleans, the Merleton squash was more than just a vegetable. It was a holiday tradition, climbing in lush green vines over fences and the iconic shotgun houses. Known for its delicate flavor, this specific heirloom variety of chayote was a Christmas staple, requiring seed-saving passed down meticulously from neighbor to neighbor. The tragedy arrived in 2005, not just as wind and rain, but as the enduring corrosive curse of Hurricane Katrina. As the floodwaters receded, they left behind a toxic residue of salt, petroleum sludge, and sewage that irrevocably contaminated the fertile terra firma in the surrounding parishes. The fragile Mirliton, deeply rooted in its native soil, could not tolerate this sudden, toxic change. More tragically, the flood scattered the very community that preserved the seeds. The home gardeners, the quiet stewards of this unique crop, were displaced, severing the decades-old chain of custody that ensured Merleton's survival. These were not crops lost to pestilence, but to the slow, poisonous revenge of a devastated environment and a broken community. Merleton's exile shows how a natural disaster can erase a vegetable not through physical destruction, but by dissolving the human connection vital for its existence. It's a somber lesson on the fragility of local food culture. Next, a tragedy that didn't flood the land, but sent it straight into the sky. The cowpea of the empty heartland. Before the skies darkened and the soil began to blow away, the cowpea varieties of the Great Plains, like the resilient black-eyed pea, were the unsung heroes of the heartland. These nitrogen-fixing crops thrived where others failed, acting as a crucial survival food that was high in protein, essential for the homesteads of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas. The tragedy began not with a natural disaster, but with human hubris. Poor deep plowing techniques stripped the prairies of their natural, protective grasses. When the sustained drought arrived in the 1930s, the region's rich earth had nothing to anchor it. The resulting Dust Bowl was an environmental apocalypse. Massive black blizzards choked the skies, making cultivation impossible and stripping the topsoil down to bedrock. As the Okies packed their meager possessions onto trucks in the mass exodus, they weren't just leaving their homes, they were forced to abandon their farms and, critically, their local seed banks. Specific regional strains of the cowpea, adapted over generations to the harsh climate, were lost as fields became dust and the chain of custody was irreversibly broken. The seeds were literally buried or blown away, forever forgotten in the soil's rage. The cowpea's vanishing act shows that sometimes the greatest curse upon the harvest is the failure of man to respect the very ground that sustains him. But what happens when the curse is not the environment, but the government that feeds you? The Liberty Cabbage's name: change. America had entered the First World War, and suddenly anything with a German heritage was deemed suspect, including the very vegetables on the dinner plate. This was not an environmental disaster. It was a furious cultural purge fueled by wartime propaganda. The biggest target? The vast, rich fields of German-derived cabbages used to make sauerkraut, a staple of immigrant communities and farm pantries alike. Overnight, an executive order fueled by xenophobia renamed this perfectly innocent, hearty, fermented food. Sauerkraut was no more. It was now Liberty Cabbage. This act wasn't just absurd, it caused a deep rift in agricultural tradition. The pressure to abandon anything associated with the enemy led to the systematic replacement of older, superior German heirloom cabbage varieties with more generic, politically acceptable strains. Farmers stopped planting their traditional seeds for fear of being deemed unpatriotic. The original, rich German-style cabbages, bred for specific fermentation qualities, faded from the American seed banks, quietly becoming a footnote in a dark chapter of history. It was a tragedy where a vegetable was destroyed not by blight, but by the acidic corrosion of propaganda. The forced vanishing of the German cabbage teaches us that the greatest threats to our heritage crops are not always natural, but can be the volatile political winds of fear. Next, a vegetable conquered by the relentless march of asphalt and concrete, the squash of the concrete tide. It sits on a cutting board, squat and ribbed like an antique cheese wheel, a vegetable that was once the proud signature crop of an entire region. The Long Island cheese pumpkin was specifically bred for the rich, sandy soil of New York, cherished for its smooth texture and reliable sweetness. But its tragedy was not a single sharp disaster. It was the inexorable, creeping tide of urbanization. Beginning after the Second World War, the fertile farmland that stretched across Long Island was slowly, acre by acre, swallowed by the concrete tide of suburban sprawl. The fields where generations of farmers cultivated this specific squash were paved over for endless subdivisions, strip malls, and highways. The rapid loss of agricultural land meant the regional food system that supported this heirloom variety simply ceased to exist. Unlike a foreign blight, the enemy here was development, a political and economic choice that sacrificed long-term food history for short-term housing needs. Farmers like the Van Zandt family had to sell their generational holdings, and the heartbreak of that final decision was matched only by the loss of the seed banks of this exceptional pumpkin, broken up and forgotten. It became easier to buy a generic pumpkin shipped across the country than to find the one that gave the island its name. The vanishing of the cheese pumpkin shows how the slow, quiet erosion of a city's farmlands can be just as fatal to a crop as any sudden catastrophe. It remains a ghostly memory in the history of American vegetable diversity. But in the mountains, another vegetable fell victim to a different kind of economic collapse: the bitter root of the coal fields. High in the isolated valleys of Appalachia, a massive, strange-looking squash known as the candy roaster was once treasured, a sweet, thick-fleshed heirloom that sustained families through the coldest winters. For the mountain communities, this squash was a vital caloric staple, often reaching 25 pounds and storing for months without refrigeration. Its tragedy was inextricably linked to the region's economic foundation: the devastating collapse of the coal economy. When the mines closed and jobs vanished, a wave of desperate mass migration swept through the hollows, emptying out the small subsistence farms. These mountain gardens, which had nurtured the candy roaster for generations, were suddenly left untended. Unlike commercial crops, this squash required the careful, dedicated effort of family gardeners to save and exchange its specific seeds each year. As families were forced to move north to find work, they couldn't take their entire farming history with them. The seed lines were broken, the patches left to become overgrown wilderness, and the heirloom varieties were either lost to isolation or forgotten in the scramble for survival. The candy roaster's vanishing is a culinary symbol of the economic hardship that tore the heart out of Appalachia. The quiet disappearance of this nourishing squash shows us how the devastation of a single industry can destroy an entire regional food culture, leaving a literal bitter root where sweetness once grew. Next, the fate of the harvest destroyed by a civil war, General's infamous march, scorched earth's survival, Pia. The fields of the American South were not just battlegrounds. They were silent victims of the Civil War, a war fought not only with rifles, but with food supply. The humble field pea varieties became critical to survival, a high-protein, nourishing crop essential for both Union and Confederate civilians struggling with shortages. The tragic turning point was General William Tecumseh Sherman's notorious scorched earth policy during his march. He instructed his troops to destroy the South's infrastructure and, crucially, its agricultural capacity, including barns, mills, and food stores. This was wholesale agricultural destruction. Seed stocks were burned, crops were trampled, and the sophisticated food preservation systems of the antebellum period were annihilated. While some peas survived, the constant threat of confiscation or destruction forced farmers to plant whatever was immediately available, often resulting in rampant crossbreeding and compromised genetics. This rapid, uncontrolled mixing led to the silent loss of pure, resilient, and locally adapted heirloom strains. The field pea descended from a treasured staple into a generic, forgotten commodity crop. Its genetic diversity was sacrificed for immediate, desperate survival. The fate of the field. Pea proves that the collateral damage of human conflict often lasts longer than the fighting, erasing centuries of carefully cultivated seed history in a matter of months. But could a garlic braid be considered an act of treason? The 5-braid garlic's exile. Imagine standing in the rich black soil of a Ukrainian family garden, watching women meticulously braid garlic into long, elegant ropes. This 5-braid tradition wasn't just decorative storage, it represented a defiance against the coming storm. The tragic event was the forced collectivization of agriculture under the Soviet state, an ideological purge that viewed individual farming and private seed saving as counter-revolutionary acts. Under Stalin's regime, self-sufficiency was deemed treasonous. The state systematically dismantled traditional farming, seizing land and forcing peasants onto massive, impersonal collective farms focused on commodity crops. This industrial approach had no patience for the dozens of specific, localized, and unique heirloom garlic strains that families had perfected over centuries. When the families who held the knowledge were purged or exiled, the meticulous care and documentation of these specific strains vanished with them. The seeds became political victims. Only through the quiet, defiant practice of small-scale kitchen gardens did these specific, resilient garlic varieties survive, hidden beneath the surface of the state-controlled system. They were relics of a time when the food on your table was a matter of family pride, not government quota. The story of the braided garlic shows that the most brutal extinction event for a crop can be a political ideology that seeks to erase the history and self-reliance of its own people. The next curse was created by politicians who simply decided to drain an entire sea. The drying delta's bean. Tulare Lake, once the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi, was a teeming inland sea in California, nurturing a delta where native peoples cultivated specific varieties of highly adapted indigenous beans. These unique strains depended entirely on the lake's vast, moist ecosystem, their roots seeking out the damp, fertile soil near the shrinking shorelines. The tragedy was not an earthquake or a volcano, but a political decision. The wholesale diversion of the lake's feeding rivers, the Kings, Kaweah, and Tule, for aggressive agricultural expansion and cash crops. Over several decades, this enormous body of water was systematically drained, shrinking from nearly 700 square miles to a dust-choked basin. The loss of the massive water source completely altered the soil ecology, creating dry, arid ground that was wholly incompatible with the native bean strains. These beans, adapted over millennia to the delta moisture, could not survive the engineered desert that replaced their home. The farmers who held the generational knowledge were displaced, and the seed lines were destroyed, sacrificed to irrigate commercial export crops like cotton and almonds. A profound natural resource and the unique food crops it supported vanished for the sake of profit. The disappearance of the Tulare Delta's indigenous bean is a sobering record of the human cost of water politics, showing that sometimes a vegetable is eliminated not by drought, but by the engineer's channel. But no man-made flood compares to the speed and shame of the next American tragedy, the internment celery. In the early 1940s, the American celery market was almost entirely controlled by highly skilled Japanese-American farmers, whose meticulous techniques and generations of agricultural knowledge produced the nation's highest quality crops. They had developed specific celery strains adapted perfectly to California's climate and soil. The tragic event was not a drought or a pestilence, but a chilling act of political paranoia. Executive Order 9066. Suddenly, tens of thousands of productive citizens were stripped of their liberty and forced into remote internment camps. Their sophisticated farms were immediately abandoned or sold off for pennies. Their specialized equipment rusted, and their carefully managed seed stocks were lost. This order erased not just livelihoods, but decades of specialized breeding work. These were specific seeds that represented 40 years of perfect integration into the American food landscape. Other, less experienced farmers quickly took over the land, resulting in an immediate and noticeable drop in quality of American celery. The forced removal of these expert farmers caused a catastrophic and permanent genetic loss in the United States vegetable supply. The internment celery stands as a silent testimony to a national shame, proving that when prejudice uproots people, the entire food system suffers an irreversible loss of quality and diversity. Next, a vegetable that was deemed a competitor to Christianity itself, the outlawed spirit, conquest, and the amaranth. To the mighty Aztec civilization, the grain-like vegetable amaranth was far more than a staple food. It was a sacred crop, woven into spiritual rituals and used in offerings to the gods. High in protein and perfectly adapted to the dry, high-altitude climate, amaranth sustained millions and represented the strength of their culture. The tragedy began with the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors, who saw not a miraculous food, but a direct competitor to their own authority. Seeking to dismantle the indigenous culture and impose Christianity, the conquerors targeted the most sacred element of the Aztec identity. A decree was issued. Amaranth cultivation was outlawed, punishable by severe penalty or even death. This was a brutal form of cultural erasure, a campaign to starve the Aztec spirit by eliminating its most vital and ritualistic crop. Farmers were forced to uproot their fields, leading to the rapid, deliberate destruction of most popular strains. Amaranth did not vanish entirely, it retreated. Small, defiant communities carried the seeds into isolated mountain regions, quietly maintaining small, hidden patches. This act of resistance saved the plant from total extinction, but decades of political fear and isolation ensured that many unique, regional strains of the outlawed spirit were permanently lost to history. The suppression of amaranth shows the profound power held within a single seed, and how the conquering of a people often begins with the destruction of their food. Our final domestic tragedy was caused not by foreign invasion, but by neighborly suspicion. The Salem witches' abandoned garden. Travel back to the year 1692, to a colonial town crippled by a sudden, consuming paranoia. In Salem, the most dangerous place a woman could be was in her garden, especially if she possessed detailed knowledge of how to use the plants growing there. The herbs, once sources of healing and flavor, thyme for seasoning, feverfew for medicine, became evidence of a dark secret. The tragedy here was not a blight on the potato, but a chilling blight on humanity. As the witch trials raged, the women who were the vital stewards of these small, complex gardens were arrested or imprisoned. Their sophisticated knowledge of medicinal and cooking herbs, passed down through the generations, was suddenly twisted into a sign of sorcery. With the gardeners gone, the annual cycle of planting, harvesting, and, most crucially, seed saving was brutally disrupted. The gardens themselves were abandoned, left to wither and choke with weeds. Many unique, regional varieties of herbs, whose survival depended on meticulous human intervention, were irreversibly lost. Their demise was caused by fear and neglect, not nature. The fertile ground of their plots became silent memorials to the terrifying power of mass delusion. The abandoned gardens of Salem show that sometimes the most precious harvest to be lost is not the vegetable itself, but the ancestral knowledge of the women who knew how to grow it. Our final cursed crop was a victim of political isolation on a global scale, the political pumpkin of the Iron Curtain. After the ashes of the Second World War settled, a rigid political line, the Iron Curtain, descended across Europe, physically and ideologically splitting communities that had shared markets and agricultural traditions for centuries. The tragedy was that of political division, which split regional seed banks and local knowledge, causing a slow Cold War extinction for many crops. Take a specific Eastern European squash, for example, a local landrace pumpkin variety, perfected over time to thrive in the harsh continental climate. Its survival had depended on the annual exchange of seeds between isolated villages and regional markets that now lay on opposite sides of barbed wire. The new political borders did not just restrict human movement, they interrupted the natural flow of genetic material. Farmers on one side could no longer refresh their stock with seeds from their cousins just miles away. This sudden, enforced isolation created a severe genetic bottleneck, leading to inbreeding, weakness, and vulnerability to disease. As collective farming focused on standardized, government-approved varieties, these unique, regionally adapted pumpkins simply faded away, starved of the diversity and collaboration they needed to survive. The story of the political pumpkin is a bitter reminder that ideological conflict can destroy a harvest as effectively as any disease, showing how political isolation creates permanent gaps in our world's agricultural history. If these stories of erased harvests made you look at your kitchen differently, then please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories that shape our world.